morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I'm Cheryl McGillivray, Chief Accountant and CFO at the Alberta Securities Commission, and I'm honored to be the moderator for our first panel on opportunities in energy. We're in the midst of significant transformation, all within an ever-changing landscape. But with change comes opportunities. So we'll be exploring what those opportunities are for Alberta to take leadership in all things energy. We're also going to discuss Alberta's pathway to meeting Canada's plan for net zero emissions by 2050 and how Alberta Energy can be part of that solution. And since climate change and ESG has evolved very quickly in importance, and it's where significant investment dollars are being directed, we're also going to explore whether ESG can unlock capital for the energy sector. And here to discuss these topics is an amazing panel who bring broad perspectives. I'm very pleased to now introduce our panel, starting with Don Farrell. Don is the former president and CEO of TransAlta. Dawn has been a leader in the electricity business for 35 years. She's also worked many of those years with ESG and transformation to renewables. Dawn is now a board member for Comowers and Canadian Natural Resources and is also Chancellor from Mount Royal University. Our next panelist is Tristan Goodman. Tristan is the president of the Explorers and Producers Association of Canada, also known as EPAC, which is a national group that advocates and represents Canada's oil and gas entrepreneurs. Tristan has a wealth of expertise in many areas, including natural resource management, law, environmental science, and also economic history. And our third panelist is Kevin Krausert, who is the CEO and co-founder of Avatar Innovations. Kevin spent 20 years on the front line of energy transition in numerous executive leadership roles. He is an entrepreneur, a dreamer, and also a scientist. Kevin led a major corporation through the disruption in the Canadian energy industry, and through Avatar Innovations, he has ambitious plans to unlock energy transition solutions inside oil and gas. You can find out more about our distinguished panelists on our website, albertasecurities.com. So welcome, panelists. Also, just to let you know, the forum will be open towards the end of our session in order to give the audience an opportunity to ask questions of our panelists. And please, as you think of those questions, enter them on the Q&A section, which can be found at the bottom of your screen. So before I turn it to the panel, I would like to highlight for the audience an important proposed rule on climate change related disclosures that the CSA just published on Monday. The ASC, working within the CSA, has been focused on climate change disclosures for several years now. That work started in 2017. We have monitored where regulators outside of Canada are in terms of requirements for climate change disclosures. And we have seen many of those jurisdictions have moved ahead very quickly, and most have aligned with the TCFD framework. We also know that the SEC will be publishing their proposed rules in the very near term. The ASC has also been extensively engaging with market participants here in Alberta so that we do have a better understanding of what the information is that investors and stakeholders are seeking. What are the gaps, and also what are the challenges? And we know there are challenges. We did make the decision to move forward with these proposed rules because we believe Canada's capital market needs to be competitive on a global basis, but also recognizing the uniqueness of Canada's resources and the need for them to be considered. So for those of you in the audience that this rule may affect, we really encourage you to review the rules. Please submit your comments, as your input is highly valued. Now, that comment process will be open until January 17th of 2022. So let's get started. I'd like to kick off the discussion by asking each of our panelists if you could give your perspective on where you see the greatest opportunities for the broader energy sector here in Alberta, And if you can also speak to some of the challenges that we might see along the way. And Tristan, I'm going to ask you to kick this one off.
Sure. Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. So there's no question that as we look into the future, we're seeing some great opportunities across the sector. Certainly, the folks that I work with a lot, oil and gas, that's, to be frank, going to go, I think, through a bit of a renaissance. Nothing really less than that, than really a rebirth. And I think what you're going to see there is actual fundamental change. This is not simply following a commodity price cycle. These are folks that have realized that we're going through an energy transition. There is a serious change that in the way people are going to develop all sorts of energy use in the future. That said, of course, we also can look around the world, as mentioned by the minister, and understand that this is going to take quite a lot of time. There are some great opportunities to integrate renewables into the existing energy business, including oil and gas. There's also some fantastic opportunities for the energy sector, particularly in Alberta, to look forward short-term, mid-term, and long-term. And I guess being very specific, we have to look at, and I'm sure the other panelists will speak to some of the great opportunities in other sectors. But if I look at the oil and gas sector, it's probably just worth mentioning a few key variables there that are important. And maybe just starting at the top level. We continue to see demand for natural gas and oil on a go-forward basis, both domestically and globally. There are going to be changes in that. There's no question. And that demand has to be managed by the business community as well as by governments, or we're going to sort of end up in a bit of a sticky situation, and that is starting to show up within the United Kingdom, within China, and also even in the United States. It's always interesting to see the dynamic of progressive leaders trying to find a way to move through this energy transition, and at the same time today saying, we have a problem. We have got to maintain prices for consumers at reasonable levels as we move through that. And we've seen that happening in the United States. I think then moving down, looking at what's happening at the macro environment, you can sort of see that there has been an unusual situation with supply and with demand, both on natural gas and on oil. As financial institutions transition and ESG becomes increasingly important, and there's certainly no denying that, this is something that everybody has got to pay attention to, and we've got to find a way to work within that framework. I think what you're seeing is supply is in the short term, but also long-term tightening, both in natural gas and in oil. And this is at the same point in time that you're seeing demand has not fully recovered yet. And it doesn't take a genius in economics to sort of figure out what happens when those two sort of collide. And I think we are heading into a situation that can present some real opportunities. That is not simply, though, and this is the key, simply just to capitalize or go back or regress into a previous business model. That's certainly not where folks are looking. And that's maybe the final point that I'll just mention. Specifically within the Canadian oil and gas sector, I think it is completely different if you look globally. Having worked in many different jurisdictions and many different continents around the world, the reality is this is a sector that has been for years focused on cost reductions, while maintaining that high performance and that high standard. Those standards have actually increased during that period. So you're seeing actually some cost controls. You're seeing actually much better balance sheets now. If you look across the sector, people have used the high price environment, and instead of doing what often has happened in the past, there's been tremendous responsibility and focus on what investors and financial institutions have demanded. And that focus has produced some pretty strong companies going forward. Those that are here now are very well positioned. The final point within that is you're seeing an unbelievable effort and really quite remarkable results compared to other jurisdictions on GHG emissions. Let's remember, Alberta was actually one of the leaders in the 1990s on reducing flaring, one of the most serious concerns within the sector. People often forget, and we tend actually not to talk about our positive history in this province, of how good we really have been, whether that is on CCUS or recent emerging hydrogen, or looking back at reduced flaring. There's no question we're leaders. What we're seeing now, though, is there's actually an opportunity to capitalize on that. Just from a pure financial point of view, we're seeing those internationally pay for that cleaner product. It's just starting to emerge. It's not there yet. But that's why I think, that it's not just about, it's not so much just about one sector transitioning. This is going to be much more an integrated approach, a much more collaborative approach, and a much more realistic approach, where I actually think what you'll probably end up seeing over time is really a lot of the oil and gas companies becoming almost energy companies. They're going to diversify substantially into other areas. They're already starting to do that. Some have done that extremely in a successful way. And I think you're going to continue to see that. So those would be my opening comments. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Tristan. Kevin, can we maybe turn to you next?
So just let me get myself off mute there. Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for the invitation. I say this frequently, but frankly, I think reaching a net zero economy is going to be the Apollo project of our time. It is going to take an all hands on deck approach from business, the scientific community, technological, as well as the financial markets. And certainty and clarity from both the regulators and the financial markets is going to be a critical factor for us to reach this audacious goal. And I would like to thank the ASC for having this important conversation this morning. The reality is the race to net zero is not going to be easy or simple. Yet the reality is that many of the most compelling solutions to climate change exist inside the oil and gas industry. Simply put, we can't electrify every energy source. And the solutions to decarbonize the other half of the emissions challenge are currently being worked on in the energy sector. And so if we accept that these solutions, whether it's hydrogen, carbon capture, carbon removal, long duration energy storage, are going to be critical and necessary to reaching net zero, the question we have to ask ourselves is, who is going to deploy these solutions and win this race better than the industry that is already experts in it and busily deploying them? So the focus we really have to ask ourselves is, how do we use regulators and financial markets to supercharge these technologies and deploy them? And so how are we going to do this? First and foremost, the trillions of dollars of global energy infrastructure that exists, and the experts running them are going to be the ones who are going to be able to need to drive this change if we're going to come up with the most economic means of getting there. Second, the incumbents and technology players and researchers are going to have to figure out a way to work together in a means that is faster, simpler, and cheaper than what we've done before. So essentially, I think we need a lot more sandboxes to try new things. And the good news is the energy industry is busily working on them right now. But thirdly and finally, we're going to need capital and risk capital to be able to drive this change. Even with the wildly increased profitability of the energy sector, most energy firms are trading at some pretty discounted valuations. At best, 5 times cash flow, at worst 3 times. And so this is creating a cost of capital issue to be able to drive the necessary change inside the infrastructure that exists. And then conversely, on the clean tech sector, you've got valuations that are through the roof, frankly, at unsustainable levels, 50 times cash flow. And now one way to look at that is to say, oh, well, that's where the capital is going. But the other way to look at it is that that's where there's not enough good deals. And so how do we create more good deals? And you need oil and gas at the table to be able to generate those good deals, to work on the existing infrastructure that is going to be necessary. So we need to work together again in new ways. So in short, the challenge and the opportunity that you're speaking about is, I think, figuring out how to unlock these three pieces of the puzzle, bringing the incumbents to the table, working together new ways, and unlocking full life cycle capital. And the good news is, I'd say the industry is busy at work. And if we accept that the shared focus really just needs to be, how do we lower emissions as quickly as possible and as economically as possible? That should be the focus, I think, of regulators, financial markets, and businesses alike. And so I'm very excited. You know, Tristan was mentioning that, he feels like it's pretty exciting. And I think actually the oil and gas industry in Alberta and Calgary right now reminds me of the late 90s, when there was this incredible entrepreneurial spirit. We were doing, crazy things like trying to drill horizontal wells and looking at what hydraulic fracking was, and look at what we did. And so I think we can do the exact same thing with carbon capture and hydrogen and carbon removal. And there is a sense of entrepreneurship emerging in this sector that I think is super exciting. So let's, keep the financial markets and keep the entrepreneurs and keep the businesses focused on what I think is a huge opportunity for our city and our province.
Great, thank you very much. You both have raised some excellent comments that we'll come back to. Dawn, I would like to turn it over to you now for your comments.
Thank you, Cheryl, and thanks for the opportunity, and thanks to my co-panelists, because there's really not much more that I could say. But the only thing that I can add, because I agree with everything that's been said so far, and I do sense a changing way of thinking about net zero that hasn't been there before, for sure. Like, and when you look at, the plan that for example, the oil sands companies have put together, they call it pathways. I mean, we are actually in Canada in 2021 with with a plan that already has 3 phases to it to get to net zero in the oil and gas sector and the mining sector for oil sands mining by 2050. That is pretty incredible and remarkable. We already have transitioned much of the Alberta electricity fleet from coal to gas, and we're adding lots of renewables. That is really exciting. So I think the thing that I see to just sort of put the icing on the cake of how we really take advantage of where we are, we have a regulatory structure here in Canada. We have a carbon price in Canada. We have a long-term carbon price. We actually have a pathway to a carbon price by 2030. At TransAlta, when I was there, we advocated over and over and over again with the government to create a pathway, because the challenge with carbon pricing is it can go up and down as governments change. We're talking 30 years, governments are going to change. But right now, today, we have a pathway. And to the extent that we can get more and more regulatory certainty on an incentive structure for Canada. So if Canada is going to use a carbon price, if it's going to use some tax incentives for CCUS, which we're all desperately waiting for that to happen, all of that allows Canadians to take the plans they actually have today and start to invest the capital that they're making today in what is an energy crisis today. We do have an energy crisis today. We have a big problem here. We have way more demand than supply. And the financial markets are going, should I really put money over in oil and gas? Because what they're asking is, does ESG mean get rid of fossil fuels? Does energy transition mean get rid of fossil fuels? Or does it mean invest to get to a lower carbon economy? And if it means invest to get to a lower carbon economy, lots of capital is coming our way, and we are absolutely ready. And we have most of what we need in the regulatory system to start to move in that direction, with a few bells and whistles that could get us there. So we have a lot of reason to be very optimistic. We still have heavy lifting to do to get a couple more regulatory pieces, because as we, in this panel, we know the US uses tax incentives like crazy. I mean, they built their whole wind business on huge tax incentives that ended up on the balance sheets of some pretty large companies down there. Everybody is going hard and fast on this. We've got a great starter kit. We got a great plan. We've got the right kind of entrepreneurial spirit in Alberta. Albertans never lay down in the ditch, despite what people think. And so I think we are really well positioned with a few more changes. But to ensure that capital really comes to this kind of effort, we have to make sure that ESG and energy transition means reducing carbon, not killing fossil fuels.
Great comments from all of you. And I want to just delve into first the opportunities, and then I think we'll get into the ESG and net zero. But Minister Tays talked about some of the opportunities. All of you have talked about the opportunities. In your view, though, and I think, Tristan, you mentioned short, medium, and long term. What is this short term? I mean, we have not only net zero by 2050, the federal government has also got an interim goal of 40 to 45% reduction by 2030. Can we do that? And clearly you're saying we can't do it without energy, but here in Alberta, what do you see as the short-term opportunities, and what are the regulatory burdens that might be in the way? You spoke about tax credits as well, but can you elaborate on some of these? I'll open that up.
I think actually Kevin and Dawn have just touched on these, but generally I think short term you're looking at a couple, probably three key items. You're definitely looking immediately, and it's already in practice actually, CCUS, and that's defined simply not just as pure sequestration, but also enhancing existing reservoirs, which does capture a significant amount of carbon. The other one is obviously where you're looking at methane. Methane is actually a great one to look at. It's very short term, it's high innovation, it's high technology, and it's immediate. And it affects both natural gas and oil. So that's very constructive. And you know, can you, I guess you're really asking, are the federal government targets realistic? And I'm just going to be honest, they are ambitious, there's no question, and that's actually okay. We need to sort of stop sort of messing around with, is it 30, is it 40, is it, look, we need some ambitious targets. We need to all remain focused on this issue. And I think there's been some outstanding work across the sector. The very large, you know, someone mentioned the Pathways Initiative from the oil sands, a tremendous opportunity. That really is just remarkable of where those companies are going to come together as a unit. But you're seeing similar things in the natural gas business, and you're seeing many things in the conventional oil side. The conventional oil side, look at what they've done with CCUS, groups like Whitecap and others. I mean, you're just getting really strong activity there. So, and it's not about an individual company, it goes across the whole thing. So I think those are the short term. The longer one is hydrogen, which I hope we have an opportunity to talk about. That's more challenging, but very real.
Yeah, Cheryl, let me just add, you know, you can't, it's hard not to be influenced by what happened in COVID. And in particular, you know, I think it was 72 hours after they got the virus, a bunch of scientists had the vaccine, and then it's taken a while to get it implemented. But, you know, it's been remarkable in the last 2 years. The federal government right now is looking at a tax incentive for CCUS. If they put that in place, that's our vaccine, because that unlocks a lot of money to start investing in CCUS in the short term. And that becomes for Alberta. Remember when Peter Lougheed did the petrochemical investments, and it changed the game for Alberta. It made us a place where you went to invest in petrochemicals. We are just on the verge of a big investment boom in CCUS. that will definitely create a huge dent in the targets that the federal government has set by 2030. So I think we are the pathways plan, all the different regulatory stuff that we're working on. That's probably the key one to unlock that. And then I agree 100% with Tristan. My work on hydrogen, I don't know how, and I'll just say it simply this way. You know, using electricity to make the fuel to make electricity doesn't make sense from just a mass balance perspective. You would never do that. There's got to be other solutions. Now, maybe Tristan's thought it through better than I have, but I think hydrogen is a different play. I think it's the hydrogen, Tristan, I think is the play for the heavy combustion engines and the heavy vehicles. And it competes against diesel. But when people talk about hydrogen to make electricity, I just can't figure that out. And maybe you haven't, or maybe you have, Kevin.
I've spent a lot of time working on hydrogen, but I will admit it's not the easiest nut to crack. But maybe just before we add that, I want to just build on one of Dawn's point around, you know, if you think about the power of the vaccine, when we set, you know, financial markets, governments, and scientific researchers and businesses to work busily in one way and then took the restrictions out of their way, look at what we did. We came up with a vaccine in 12 months. And so what can we learn from that? Because we're going to need all of these different pieces of the puzzle. I agree with Tristan's, you know, assessment of methane and CCS as being really quick, short wins here that we can meaningfully impact restrictions. But I think that there's, you know, not just the hydrogen kind of chicken or the egg challenge. I think it's going to be an infrastructure play. You know, looking at a lot of the technologies that are out there, that this is big infrastructure money that's going to have to be looked at. And yeah, it's going to be long haul transport is really where I see hydrogen coming in along rail. That's the space that it seems to start making a lot of most sense. You're starting to see some interesting investments around, you know, the bus fleet deployments. I think is maybe an easy, quick way to sort of start unlocking a little bit of a hydrogen economy. In Vancouver, you've been seeing that. I'd like to maybe put a couple other medium-term wins that I think are available. It's not just CCS, but without getting in super technical, what I'm going to call kind of second generation CCS that is cheaper and lower cost or lower energy efficiency. Those aren't technologies kind of ready out of the gate right now, but they're, I'd say, 2 to 3 years away. And then I'd also like to put on the table something I think Canada's already a global leader in, which is maybe a little bit longer term, but I think a bit of a game changer is carbon removal. You've got, you know, the ability to pull CO2 out of the atmosphere and permanently store it. There's some pretty exciting technologies there with some rapidly changing economics that are there. And, you know, if you look at those emissions that are just really difficult to abate, I think that in 5-10 years, carbon removal is going to be a very interesting piece of the puzzle for the final pieces of the emissions problem.
That's really great, and can't help but get into a little bit on ESG. We know that Canada has really high standards on ESG. However, the view of local, national, and international doesn't seem to be recognizing that fully. Do you have any thoughts on how we might be able to change that narrative, or is that even possible? Because it is certainly directing some of the sustainable financing.
I've been looking at that question for days now going, you know, how do you really do that? And I think the best I can come up with is the narrative changes when the action happens and shows up in the results. And it doesn't change until then. So I was thinking about at TransAlta, you know, we had to go through the transition from coal to gas and coal to gas and renewables. And we started our work in 2015, but we actually started our work I started on the carbon file in 1988. I bought carbon offsets for the company in 1990. But by the time we got to 2015, when the regulatory environment changed in Alberta, we had significantly reduced our emissions, just like Tristan said, just like the oil and gas companies had. But we were a coal company. And from 2015 to now, we transitioned away from coal to natural gas. We bought a lot of renewables. We changed the whole mix. And just to give you the stat, the company produced, I think, 42 million megatons of carbon in 2006. And by the end of 2022, it'll be 11. So it's a huge, I think the stat is if we were a country, we'd be the #1 reducer of carbon in the world. But the market never recognized that until this year. And the reason they never recognized it until this year is because this is the last year that coal will run in the company. Everything's gas from here. We've even reduced some of the ambitions around the gas, or the new team over there is doing that. So the action now aligns with what we said, and now the recognition is just pouring into the company. That will happen for Canadian oil as well. So I think that's how it has to happen. So in a lot of ways, it's the way I run everything. I go, stop talking, just do. Stop talking, just do. When they see what you've done, then they change the narrative, I think.
Yeah, I have to agree. I love that statement around sometimes we need to just stop talking. We can be our own worst enemy here, unfortunately. We have, I mean, in this meeting, I think we can all look to the numbers. We probably have a tremendous number of very sophisticated people on the line here that can follow the data. Look at the data within the various energy sectors across Alberta over the last 20 years and their trajectory on GHG emissions, and then forecast that forward to 2050, assuming that that consistency continues on reduction. And you're basically exceeding expectations or policy agenda, assuming that that occurs. The problem I think we have is, I think Canadians, and also more globally, people want to know actually that we're on the bus and that we understand that we need to move with society's expectations. And I think sometimes we get so technical and so wrapped up in our own success that we forget to start the conversation with, we've heard you, we have an emissions problem, we're with you, we're going to move forward. And we are, but I don't think that always is coming across. The issue started with, where are we at with what energy transition means? There, you have to really understand how the global economy works. If you look at it from a macro fiscal monetary point of view, you have a highly integrated global economy that's running on hydrocarbons. And that is a problem for other aspirations in policy. That doesn't mean that you aren't transitioning to other renewables and other sources of energy, but you're still going to need hydrocarbons, probably for generations. And with that, what you would like to do is dramatically reduce the negative impact of those hydrocarbons. And when you accept that and you move forward on that, all sorts of opportunities come out. So the one piece I just want to mention, though, on all of this, what you're going to need, and it's showing up a little bit, and we've heard about it, the federal CCUS tax credit, or the same thing would apply within Alberta and the Alberta pore space allocation piece. Those have to align. So policy is important here, and no one can get left behind. You have to make sure we have different players in our market. We have very large players, we have medium players, and we have small players, and they all have to have a role and a place within there. And so policy development has to accommodate all of those different roles. And that's probably one of the challenges we're going to experience. Multi-billion-dollar projects are fantastic. Many, many $100 million projects actually can also create multi-billion-dollar opportunities. So that always has to be considered in the policy development in Alberta and federally. So.
Okay. I don't know, Kevin, if you want to weigh in or.
Yeah, I think the great points raised by Dawn and Tristan. There's sort of, I guess, two buckets I'd kind of unpack there. First would be around the, how institutional equities and capital markets are going to be viewing the ESG contributions that the oil and gas sector is making, enough to potentially sway some investment decisions. And then the second is more the how we tell that story. So, if we accept that the sector that's going to probably have the most meaningful impact on actually lowering emissions, what we need is clarity and certainty from institutional equities and how to actually be able to get there. The challenge is, I'd say, from their perspective, okay, well, if you look at a company like Total, they've made, massive contributions around moving towards, solar or British Petroleum. And then they are meaningfully changes, and then they make these investments, and then the markets hammer them. And the markets will say, well, if I want to go invest in solar, am I going to go buy Total, or am I going to go and buy a solar company? And so there's the hitch point of how do you actually separate the wheat from the shaft on those types of investment decisions, and being able to drive this. And I think there is some pretty exciting conversations around, if we can actually figure that piece of the puzzle out, can we actually increase valuations? Why is a company like a Cenovus or a Suncor not seen as a sustainable investment? That should be. Those are the companies that are putting the most amount of money to lowering emissions in this country and investing and driving that change. That's to me where the exciting conversation should be happening on the financial markets and with the equities, and it is. And then on the kind of second piece of Tristan's conversation, how do we tell that story? And I think Tristan put it really well. And one of the reasons he's such an effective spokesperson for our industry is we've kind of always taken this approach as an industry. Well, they just don't understand how important our sector is. And so let's just educate them. The challenge is education doesn't work when there's an absence of trust with a skeptical public. And so they're like, these people, what are they really up to? We have to, I think, change the narrative to actually not trying to educate, but actually demonstrate or do, as Dawn says, that the energy industry is a meaningful and powerful partner in the country's climate ambitions. And that little bit of a pivot, you kind of go from climate villain to like front page of the Globe and Mail. And so that's the story thing that we need to be telling. And I think that will help shape some of the investment decisions, so that we can really start driving this investment into this change that is needed.
Cheryl, I just want to add one thing, because it triggered when Kevin was talking. Capital markets are very mysterious, and having worked in them, you're gobsmacked in terms of you're doing all the right things and no one wants you to have any capital, so they'll dump your stock. And then, you never know when capital markets are going to show up and say, hey, we really love you. Why don't you raise some equity? And you're just kind of going, oh my gosh. But I think that the challenge on the ESG thing is ESG right now is being pushed onto the publicly traded companies. The standards are being pushed on the publicly traded companies. And right now today, the equity market wouldn't fund for oil and gas, because people see oil and gas as fossil fuels are out. So why would I put my money there? So then private equity comes in and goes, hey, guys, I had this happen. Hey, TransAlta, you really have some lousy assets. Why don't you sell them to us for, 2 times cash flow, so that I can make 20% returns for my private equity guys. And you can go focus on solar, which, by the way, a solar project right now is a 5% return. So you retail investors over in the public space, you can play over there while we play with the stuff. And oh, by the way, did anybody notice that carbon emissions didn't reduce at all? In fact, they're being hidden over there. So this is pretty challenging stuff that Kevin is talking about. And so when we think about the policy, if we just have ESG metrics for companies that are issuers through the Alberta Stock Exchange or the SEC or whatever, but we don't have a policy that, the private companies can hide all their stuff over here, you could see a lot of fossil fuels just quietly going off over there to make a ton of money, because it turns out today you need oil and gas to live on this earth. So these are complicated areas to think through. And one final point, if shareholders fundamentally believe that all this is a front, ESG and energy transition is a front for get rid of fossil fuels, then they will demand that those management teams do not spend any money on carbon reduction technologies. They will demand that they give them the money back through share buybacks and through dividends. And they'll say, oh, just give us the capital and we'll go redeploy it. That is a travesty. And we do not want that. So I think it's important that as Canada goes forward with its package, that we really are about reducing carbon, getting to a lower carbon economy, and using the tools so that it's the big companies, the small companies, the medium companies, everybody finding technologies, and it becomes a renaissance of investment rather than we pick winners and losers.
And you raised a great point that I wanted to ask. Tristan, you talked about how the companies have been really moving on reducing costs, and now the cash flow is there. The price now is the best it's been for many years. Where do you see the companies going with this excess cash? Do you see them buying back shares? Do you see them getting into renewables? Like we know some are, but what are your views on the next phase of how this is going to work?
So I think we've seen a fundamental shift on commodity prices for an extended period. And and remember, we have two sectors here, and they are actually a little different. There is a difference between oil and between natural gas. The way you reduce their emissions, the markets they go into. I won't bore people with the economics of this, but that's just a fact and a reality. So the stability of reasonable prices, or even potentially high prices, and I'm not going to speculate where that goes, but reasonable prices, I think, are here for a period of time. That gives a lot of opportunities. So then the question is, what do the companies do? It's pretty obvious, actually, what they do, what they have done, and also what they're going to do. Large, medium, and small. The first is, it's been a rocky period. So they're going to clean up their balance sheets. Check, okay, we're moving forward on that. The ones that have survived have done well. And I think they're now here to stay and extremely well positioned. And I think we're all agreeing they're probably completely undervalued. I am not a financial expert on those, so I can't comment, but you just look at it and you think, holy smokes, this is remarkable. So the other thing is they are actually, one of the things they're doing is they are investing in other opportunities to reduce their GHG emissions, as well as other environmental improvements, because they think, and I believe they're right, this is important stuff now. This is something they have to address. It is not simply to say, well, we'll have this small little project with 1% of our revenue coming in from this. They are genuinely starting to explore and pilot what other major pieces can we start to integrate. And surprisingly, it's not just the very large doing that. Many small companies, and I mean small, are actively involved in geothermal, are actively putting up solar panels and wind, because they're trying to understand, how does this work? We think we want a more integrated approach on a go-forward basis. So that's very constructive. The other thing I think you will see is there's a tremendous amount of, I would say, responsibility. So in the past, I think we can all look back in history, and fortunately, I know history rather well, and I paid great attention to it because I think it's very important. Hydrogen, by the way, you want to look at hydrogen, go study 30 years of hydrogen around the world, and it will give you an answer probably going forward, by the way. Look at the George Bush administration, the Japanese hydrogen highway and things. So one of the things you're going to see is, there's no question, companies are going to try to understand, how do we position for growth, but without just riding a commodity price. These companies are positioning for the future, which is positive. So you're seeing increased dividend payments, and they're looking much more long-term. It's highly constructive, both from a financial standpoint for people that are investing, but also from a government policy standpoint on other policy agenda items.
Tristan, I'm just, you did mention the small and mid-size. I'm wondering from your lens, do you think though that the mid and small size market cap public companies are ready for the ESG disclosures and meeting the net zero like they are?
The answer is generally yes. I don't have a single company that's not involved or really forward thinking in that space. That has been a transition over the last few years, I would say. If you had asked me that question 3-4 years ago, you may have actually got a different answer. It also, though, does depend on, everything is related to really an economy of scale. So what a TransAlta or a larger entity is doing is obviously going to be different than someone that's at 3,000 barrels a day and producing natural gas. But they understand where it's going. I think it's very constructive what regulators are doing. I openly admit I have a strong bias around the ESG space. I think it is, as a former regulator, I completely understand that any regulation is an intervention in the marketplace and has to be used very cautiously. In this case, similar to the crash of 1929, when financial statements were improved, it actually benefits us to have some clarity from someone that says, we think you should, and we are the entity that can say this, we think you should move forward in this sort of direction. Okay, thank you. That is very valuable as a general rule.
That's great. I'm just going to shift a little bit. We've heard the energy crisis. It's certainly top of mind. And Peter Tzakian actually had an article yesterday's post, Financial Post, on the perils in disorderly transition. And I'm interested in your views on what might be the implications of this, in particular, on a global scale, but also here in Canada, and just wanting to get your views and thoughts on that.
Yeah, I can jump on that because it is an interesting. It's a major challenge that we've kind of walked into. What are going to be the rational solutions for us to kind of walk out of this? Because you do have this emerging thread of activism and some sharp financial thinkers that are basically saying, okay, well, because we can't temper demand, we'll just choke supply. And so any new capital that's going into that, let's let prices raise, and then that will make solar and all these emerging technologies far more economic and competitive. And so I think, first of all, we have to be cautious on our side of the equation that we don't think that the other side is claiming victory here. I was on a call with a bunch of European bankers the other day, and this is the divest fossil fuel movement. And they were like, well, this is exactly how it should go. We'll just drive the cost up of energy, and then we'll make all of these renewables economic. And so I think we need to be cognizant and aware that you can't look at this energy crisis through one particular lens, because there is multiple particular lens. And secondarily, I think that's the exact right point, is how do we drive reasonable investment into energy security such that we can actually have an effective and economic transition. If you want to derail energy transition or carbon taxes, the public does some pretty crazy things when they're grumpy. And if we keep having prices like they're seeing in Europe right now, they're going to have a grumpy public pretty quick here. And then what is that actually going to do from a policy perspective around these types of changes? So I hope that it drives a more sane and rational conversation that, divestment is too simple is too simple, it's ineffective, and it's just frankly not working to be able to drive the change that we want. So how are we going to be able to drive the change recognizing that we have responsible producers and energy suppliers that are busily working on energy transition technologies and solutions that are economic, rational, and safe, as opposed to creating a crisis that I think potentially runs the risk of creating bigger headaches down the road for all of us if we get a too grumpy public that wants to do some drastic moves on energy policy.
Good point.
Yeah, Cheryl, I mean, if you really stand back from it, what we're asking young families to do today is bear the burden of higher energy prices and paying for the fact that we didn't have to account for carbon for the last 150 years. So we never paid for carbon up until now. And everybody on this call has had the benefit of a whole lifetime of really low energy prices that afforded us huge economic benefits, huge GDP per capita, huge wealth creation that's happened in the globe. And so when we play the game of, okay, so now we'll take it all away from you guys and you got to pay the higher prices for the solar and whatever. And furthermore, you have to pay all these carbon taxes, which really are there because we use fossil fuels for the last 150 years. It's just an intergenerational transfer of liabilities, and it's highly expensive. So I think at the end of the day, as people start to think this through and really see what the implications are, it'll have to become more pragmatic. I don't know how that happens. It won't be education, because I agree with, the energy industry is not going to educate. But I think as people start to bear the consequence of that, it'll become very clear that you cannot ask my daughter who lives by me here with her 4 grandchildren in hockey and everything, to pay $1,000 a month for her energy bill because you think it's a good idea to get rid of natural gas in Alberta. You just can't. She's not going to accept it. Her and her, all the mothers at the rinks are not going for that. They need to get those kids in hockey and get them to university. So I think that people are smarter than we think, right? And that's why the world never turns out the way we think it's going to.
The only comment I'll add to that, having done decades worth of sort of policy, I think people sometimes forget government policy never, ever, without exception, survives first contact. It's like when people go to policy school, do an MPA or something, first thing they learn is whatever your plan is probably not going to look the same at the end. And that's okay. I'm not suggesting that we don't have the right policies, actually. What I'm saying is they will naturally shift and move and pivot to accommodate all the competing dynamics of policy development. It's very challenging. It is not just a regression analysis and it spits out the answer at the end and, or a discount cash flow calculation. It does not work like that. So I think we're going to hit that in 2-3 years here. And what would be nice to see is the continued commitment to move forward on this with the addition of, and I liked the word, the pragmatism, because you will need to have some increased pragmatism entering into this, not throwing everything away. We're on a path. It's a good path. We're not complaining about the path. We're not opposed to the path. We're with the path. That's very important. The issue is we do need to have a few adjustments made so this all works for all Canadians.
Great. Before I move on to one other question, I do want to get a little bit more sense on the ESG. As I announced previously, we're putting out some rules on climate change. But what about the broader E, the S, and the G? Right now, there are obviously environmental standards here in Canada, but what further work needs to be done in that area to help get this capital, and how quickly, in your views? Sure, Don.
Cheryl knows that this is an area I'm pretty passionate about. So you know, what frustrates me with ESG is ESG equals climate change. So where's the S and the G, and where's the S? And S often is, oh, how many women do you have in your boardroom? You know, let's count them. Oh, we've got 3, you know, da 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 da. And when I was the CEO of TransAlta, what I did is I looked at 4 times what the women were being paid compared to the men in the same jobs. And 4 times they were being paid 20% less, and I had to make adjustments. I was like, what the hell? How I was so surprised. I couldn't believe it. So if the S becomes, oh, how many women are there in senior management? But all of those women are getting paid 20% less. We've done nothing. And by the way, if we did the S today, we could actually get all of those women paid what they're supposed to be getting paid. And we would have actually done something on the ESG. Because we're talking the E taking until 2050. Why don't we do the S by 2022? So I'm very frustrated that ESG has become climate change, and the S and the G, I don't even think is an issue. We've had governance stuff going on forever. I don't see that as a big issue, but how to define that S correctly and importantly, and think about diversity and inclusion and what that really looks like and what those metrics are. I think nobody's working on that, and it's like it doesn't exist. So I think we should change our priorities and get on that, because we can solve those issues. And oh, by the way, all that talent that's out there that we need to do all this investment, we're gonna, like, you can't hire anybody today. What are they're calling this? The Great Resignation, not the Great Depression, the Great Resignation, because the baby boomers have had it. They're all leaving. Everybody's moving jobs right now. There's all this talent out there. So let's get the S right, get all the talent back to Alberta and get them working on CCS, and let's get going.
That was brilliant.
Agreed. And Don, you actually segued into our big question here. There is a tremendous amount of resources needed to get through this, and a big part of that is human resources. And we have had a great deal of talent here in Alberta. How do we attract and retain that talent? We're going through some serious evolution here. And I know, Kevin, you're very passionate about this topic, but I'll open it up to all of you.
Yeah, sure. I can jump on that one quickly. You know, first and foremost, that, you know, it has been a tough industry for the last 6 or 7 years. And so, you know, rightfully, there's a lot of people that are questioning what their future is. But I think that the bigger question is, how do we connect them with the purpose of what the future of the industry is? You know, some of the statistics I'm seeing, well, first of all, I believe the last number I saw was there's 12,000 unemployed petroleum engineers in Alberta alone. And the conversation, unfortunately, has tended from non-energy sectors to, you know, how do we retrain these employees to become tech developers? The challenge is, once you do that, they become a junior tech developer. And that's, if you talk to anybody in the tech community, that's not what they need. They need senior tech developers. So that doesn't solve the challenge. So the work we're doing at Avatar is really around how it's good, in my view, going to be a lot. If we're going to accept the premise that production is going to remain generally flat for the next 5 years, and that the oil companies are getting far more efficient, but we're going to be deploying all this capital into energy transition technologies or lower carbon technologies, we need an adaptable workforce and skill force that is, first of all, highly technical, but has an entrepreneurial mindset that can tackle these types of things. So it's a lot easier to take a petroleum engineer and turn them into a reservoir engineer and turn them into, say, carbon sequestration engineer. You know, I don't think it's any secret the University of Calgary just paused their petroleum engineering program for lack of uptake. Why is that not a subsurface engineering program? You know, such that, you know, you could look at reservoir mechanics, but you could also look at carbon sequestration mechanics or any of those different things. And I think the industry is moving this way in tremendous. We've got some really exciting stuff planned in for Avatar in 2022, but it's around, empowering and positioning the workforce for the energy industry of the future. And now that we've got the energy industry at the table, I think we can start moving the needle on this. If you want to solve the biggest challenge of our lifetime, which if that is a net zero by 2050, because I can't think of anything that's going to be more audacious, the energy sector is the place you want to do that. And aligning the values goals with, I think, an emerging workforce that wants to feel empowered, wants to feel engaged. And I think one of the reasons every time we open up applications for Avatar, we get 2,000 applications. How do you empower workers in a micro-credentialed world to not just listen and not just learn, but actually go and build? And I think those are the opportunities that are going to re-engage a workforce for a really exciting future.
Yeah, maybe just add a couple of things. There's no question we are going to have a workforce problem here going forward in many parts of the energy space, by the way, just generally. Geothermal is another one where, reservoir engineers have tremendous understanding of the geothermal environment. And there are opportunities in different pockets of Alberta for things of that nature. I think, the reality is we have to remember this is a very different business in Alberta. It's becoming highly integrated with other forms of energy use. And also it's exploring the problems that many are going to school for. We need to link that key component of environmental science and the understanding of how you work with our Indigenous communities and nations. Those activities that people are feeling that they wish to be involved in, I think we need to do a better job of actually explaining a lot of that innovation, technology, and actually even social sort of justice aspects are occurring in this space because they're showing up on the ground in this space. And there are great opportunities for folks that want to contribute to society as well as just earn a paycheck. And I think we need to reframe a bit of that.
Cheryl, yesterday, I'm the chancellor of Mount Royal University, so I have a new program where the chancellor goes to school. And so I join classes and I'm a lifelong student. So I go to school and then I have coffee with the professor and the students after. So yesterday I got to go to a third year environmental science class where the professor taught the students, they're doing the environmental assessment of plant life in the footprint of 5 projects in Alberta. One was a TransAlta wind farm, one was a Suncor oil sands project. So, a gas plant. And he basically in an hour and a half had 40 students look at an environmental assessment at AEP, use Google Earth, get down to the site, and figure out how you'd count the number of trees and the number of plants in a footprint to do an environmental assessment to get it approved. And the professor was originally from Nigeria, educated in England and at Waterloo. And there he is going, guys, like we have the best regulatory system in the world. Here's the kind of work you're going to have to do. And I'm sitting there going, how is it that we keep talking about how we don't have young people ready to go when I'm sitting in this classroom with 40 people we could all hire tomorrow afternoon? So I think we actually don't even know what we've got under our noses here. And it's fantastic. We've got fantastic universities, fantastic young people. They're smarter than any of us were ever at that age by miles. And I think as we start to do the action of the different things that we're talking about here, they are clamoring for jobs. Every one of those 40 kids yesterday, if you all said we need people, they would be like running to apply to get a job. So I don't think it's as bad as people say it is.
Well, that's really encouraging and fantastic, and quite exciting, actually. I am going to pause here to open it up for some questions that we have already received, and certainly we have about 10 minutes here. So, audience, if you have any further questions, please get them in. The first question I'm going to go to is open-ended to everyone. So what are the primary levers available to ensure that the market allocates adequate capital to the appropriate projects at the correct time in order to achieve net zero by 2050? Anyone want to start with that?
That is not an easy question. Maybe I'll try and give some high-level thinking on how I would be thinking or approaching it. I think actually Pathways has taken a really smart approach around this, in the sense that there's going to be multiple pathways to net zero, or there is multiple pathways to net zero, and we think we know 3 to 4 of them. There may be some others that we don't know. So what are the sort of, most economic short-term investments that can be made in lowering emissions? Those are probably your kind of quick, short wins that are going to be determined. Then I think you'd probably put some probability metrics around economics of some of these emerging technologies. As Dawn mentioned, hydrogen's not the most economic one. It does a second generation CCS project. If we wait 2 years, is that going to be more economic than if we use off-the-shelf CCS technology right now, but we can get out of the gate 2 years later? It's a bunch of probability modeling, would be, I'd say. But, economics and emissions reduction would be the 2 primary factors I would be putting into that model.
Yeah, Cheryl, I'd say it's simply, incentives drive a ton of investment, and we've got an incentive in Canada with the carbon price. If we could just get it simpler and get a few more tax incentives to drive carbon reduction technologies, I think you would be surprised. We haven't seen what's going to come today. So I think if we lever in the direction of incentives and lever away from subsidies and picking winners and losers, we can actually get quite the response in the market. And we certainly saw that in the US when they used tax policy to develop their wind fleets down there. I mean, they had massive investment in very short periods of time that no one would have ever expected, that drove down costs. I mean, the cost of a windmill went from $150 to $40 in the space of 5 or 6 years, because of the demand, because of tax incentives. So tax incentives for carbon reduction, I think, are the biggest lever in my view.
So maybe just quickly, I'll add on and certainly agree with the wise comments we've heard. There is another way of looking at this, of course, which is we seem to be in a bit of an odd place. We all know that we need high levels of financing to move forward on any of the ambitions that we have. We also know that with a fair degree of clarity, actually, what we're trying to achieve, because government policy, the benefit in Canada is it's actually relatively clear where we're going. If you go to the United States right now, it is impossible to figure out what is going on around some of these main issues. So we can look to net zero, reconciliation agenda. We can look to where everyone is moving to on a number of these files and say, okay, we can understand this. Generally, we can measure this. One of the problems we're going to face, but it's also an opportunity for some, is I think if you're a very large financial institution, you haven't figured out how to reconcile all of these policy pieces. Retail investors do not have that problem. We're in a unique space, actually, where the retail investor is going to have a lot of authority here, and quite frankly, a lot of opportunity, because other investors are still trying to figure out how to go about that. So that's another piece. I think there is a role here, an unusual role for the retail investor that's going to emerge.
That's great. The next question I have is, I chair the board of trustees of a 7 billion US investment fund in the United States, and we have yet to consider removing carbon-based industries from our investment mix. However, this will come. How do we as trustees argue for continued investment in the industry when many of the investors believe such investment is not consistent with ESG criteria? What are the best arguments that should be made? And I think you've covered it, but maybe we could concisely deal with that. Tristan, it looked like you were wanting to jump in there.
Well, I was going to let Dawn go first, actually,
Okay.
because of her experience in this area, but I'm
Yeah.
happy to comment
That's
after.
great.
Yeah, I mean, my number one argument is, first of all, the comment, we know this will come, is why? Why would you do that? You're basically saying to your fund, you can have inferior returns because you're gonna go and invest in a bunch of things that don't have any return in them. Well, private equity takes all the returns. And what I would be saying to them is, what we're going to invest in is industries and companies that have a carbon track record, that are lowering their carbon per unit over time and have an investment in a technology track record, and the superior returns will be there. And that would be how I would do it. Because I'm assuming that your investors want returns, and you'll see them leave you because they'll say one thing, but from what I've seen, they say one thing and they go elsewhere. They go to where the returns are. And if the returns are in private equity, that's where they're going to go.
Just one quick comment to add to that. Let's always keep in mind, and we always try to reinforce with investors, because it's important from a global perspective. We do not have a oil and gas GHG problem. We do not have a domestic GHG problem. We have a global climate change problem. And the way this is not actually at the top level, sort of advanced quantum physics trying to figure this out. We need to lower the GHG emission. That is the goal. You need to get the GHG emissions down. So those that are putting in significant effort and can show that and demonstrate that in a credible and verifiable way, and those are two very important items, that is a solid argument back to investors. The reality is, it is about lowering emissions. It's responsible. It's the way you're going to move forward during an energy transition.
Great. Oh, sorry, Kevin, were you going to?
I was just going to finalize that point. There's not much to add because I think Dawn and Tristan added it really well. But the one piece that I think could be added to that is also the role of influence. That that because these companies are staying, are working so busily on this, the role of your investment fund to actually be able to shape and drive decisions when you have a seat at the table is going to be far more influential to actually drive meaningful emissions reductions than basically I think what's happening right now is, trapping capital away from the, in the private markets that is not going to be as interested in driving the change.
Fantastic. One question that came in is fusion an option in the future to meet net zero? I'm hoping one of you.
I think it has to. You just saw France absolutely double down on nuclear. It is a highly efficient, energy-intensive solution, and there's a bunch of exciting stuff happening in the small modular nuclear reactors. I think it has to be. Hopefully France can go and build out their nuclear and do it safely and effectively, and show the rest of the world that it's very viable and effective form of energy.
Dawn, Tristan, do you want to jump in on this?
I think theoretically Kevin is right, but the evidence is that the costs are so high, the regulatory timeframe is so long, and again, I just don't want my daughter to pay for that. So if the small nuclear reactor people are going to get something that works, they need blanket regulatory approval for it. And it needs to be less than $80 a megawatt hour, not 250. And I think we just got to be real clear about that, because it's great technology, takes too long to do, and it's way too expensive, and the cost overruns are enormous. So
Yeah, I would agree with both. The reality is great opportunities needs to be explored, but it's one of those other long-term pieces. We have a number of options here that are all very constructive, but they're challenging from an economic perspective. And that we sometimes forget that I recognize when you're forming policy or when you have a personal view that's very strong on some of these items, absolutely there's a willingness to pay that's perhaps higher than the bulk of society. We have to remember, and I think Kevin is 100% correct here, we do not need a grumpy public. This is unhelpful when you get very large price sticker shocks going through the system. So it is an economic piece. I haven't seen the economics become more reasonable yet. And so hopefully that continues to improve.
Great. I think we have time for one more question here. And it's an interesting one. So whose responsibility is it to develop an energy transition strategy, goals, timeline, and allocation of cost benefits for Canada?
I can jump into that first. I do a tremendous amount of work, obviously, with governments. I'll say up front, and I work with all stripes of governments, and I enjoy working with all of them. I haven't actually, and I was a little surprised in this role, I actually have never met a politician that isn't sitting there for the right reasons. They obviously have strong views, no matter where they are. That's probably why they're in politics. But so I think the reality is what you're going to see is practically governments are going to have to drive a lot of this, and they're going to have to show leadership, and I believe they are, but it's going to take everybody involved. It's not going to work if it's simply coming from a single sort of almost ivory tower approach. There needs to be a more pragmatic component to this, and that involves working with the ENGO community, the Indigenous community, the finance community, and those that are actually taking those investments and making those business decisions with government. It's actually what happens in my experience is when you try to develop policy in isolation, it usually results in, quite frankly, a bit of a mess. So you've got to involve all of those stakeholders.
Great. We're almost out of time. 30 seconds each, closing remarks.
Well, I'm thanking you, Cheryl. This has been a great discussion. And I really thank my fellow panelists here. This has really been interesting. So thank you. Great having a conversation with you here this morning.
Yeah, I'll echo that, Dawn and Cheryl and Tristan. It's been a lot of fun and a lot of good thinking. I guess I'd maybe close just with the summarization of how we should be thinking about this and how can we supercharge capital investment and regulatory policy to be able to drive meaningful energy transition technologies in the most economic fashion. That needs to be the goal for everyone. But we can do this.
Well, thank you so much. It's been a real honor to sit with the other two panelists. Certainly quite impressive individuals and great conversation. I do want to acknowledge the Alberta Securities Commission leadership here. Fantastic to see the regulator hosting these events, and really, I think the right thing to do. So the only other piece I'll say is I still believe we are not using less energy around the world. All energy sources are, around globally going up. and it just presents a lot of opportunities. So within the Canadian context, there is, we've got, I think Alberta is uniquely positioned for some tremendous positives moving forward. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And I'm very honored to have had the opportunity to moderate both all of you. So thank you, Dawn, Kevin, Tristan. Ask the audience to please give them all a big virtual round of applause. And thank you, audience, for joining us. We are going to take a break and we'll be coming back at 9:40. Denise Weirs will be monitoring the next panel, which is Fostering Diversification, Private versus Public Financing. So we'll see you shortly. Thank you.